When you read I Write What I Like, there's a huge emphasis on spirituality. And for some people, one would think to themselves, what does spirituality have to do with politics? What does spirituality have to do with economics or anything in society, quite frankly? But Biko actually identified spirituality as probably one of the core defining factors of what humans actually subscribe to, right? All of us believe in something. We all believe that there is a creator. We all believe that there is some entity outside of our own bodies that has probably brought things to being. Science suggests that this began with the Big Bang. Religion suggests that there's a God. And for atheists, the conversation is, there is a creative entity out there, but they cannot entirely ascribe that to a religion or anything else because it is about what can we prove scientifically. And all these arguments to me are quite logical, right? Because it is one narratives of trying to understand how humans came about. Because we did not just appear. There must be a story of how we came about, and the human mind works largely on stories. And this is where spirituality becomes a very powerful tool, because it is actually a story about a creative entity that is in relationship with created beings. So Biko then indicates a very interesting aspect, right? He says, one, Africa believed in this idea of a God who was beyond our understanding. And so God was not even called God to an extent. In the Botswana language, we refer to God as Mudimu. And so Mudimu is this entity that existed beyond ourselves. But Mudimu was not physical. Mudimu did not have any physical features. Mudimu did not have a gender. Mudimu did not belong to a people or to a chief. Mudimu did not belong to anyone, but Mudimu was this entity that lived in and amongst all of us, right? And so Biko in his works also indicates that God was not a separate part of African spirituality. God was actually everywhere. So when you shared a meal, you were celebrating and in relationship with God. When you were in community and chatting to your friends, that in itself was an experience of God. And so you realize that the spirituality that Biko was speaking about was a spirituality that freed God from religion, right? It made God a personal thing. It made God a personal experience and a personal journey, and not this entity that had very strict rules. And when you look at this in conversation with the West, right? So you have the West that brings this idea of church, these big buildings with crosses on the top, with images of people in the buildings, and all these individuals who are known as saints, and all of them have these powerful stories around why they were made saints, and they have a lot of buildings and schools named after them, right? And this becomes the image of what God becomes when the West comes to Africa, is that one, God now all of a sudden belongs to a people. God becomes a white male. Jesus becomes also a white male who is the son of this God entity, and these two then begin to manage and run society. Ridiculous, is it not? Especially in a population of people who were more brown than they were pale, blonde, and blue-eyed, which in itself is not a good description of what white people look like globally, but nonetheless, this is what was sold to us. And so religion then comes in from the West with this very rigid idea of what God looks like, what God behaves like, and what God demands of us. And this becomes disruptive because now you have these individuals who for many years believed in a God that was everywhere, right? You didn't need to come to church. You didn't need to come into a building to find God. God was in everything, in nature, in watching animals walk around. God was in the food we ate, in the conversations we had. And now all of a sudden, God has denominations, God has priests, and all these individuals who dictate how we now speak about this God. And so, the whole Black consciousness movement says there is something wrong with an idea of a God that is not contextual. And by contextual, I mean a God that is removed from the human experience, right? How do I subscribe to a God that actually does not care about me? How do I subscribe to a God that looks foreign from what I look like? How do I subscribe to a God that represents and probably stands for everything that is opposite to what I've been told about myself? And so there becomes a huge clash in human spirituality when this God becomes foreign, right? And because God became white in Africa, there was a huge issue there, right? Is you have this entity that supposedly created you but looks nothing like you. It is a similar complex as maybe suppose a black child being adopted by a white family or a white child being raised by a black family. The questions that always come from these individuals is, why do I not look like mom or dad, right? And that's where the conversation begins. Now, imagine if that's the conversation for an adopted child in that setup, what more a whole nation who's been told that God does not look like you, nor like anything about you. And so this becomes the story of what Biko and the Black Consciousness movement want to completely destroy, because it created an identity crisis. And not only that, you realize when you read The Great Trek, right? The Great Trek is one of the most powerful stories of South African identity. And I would recommend that you invest a bit more time in researching The Great Trek and the theology behind it. The Great Trek is a story of a people who were oppressed, a people who were being killed, and a people who were running away from those who wanted to destroy them. And so they run inland, and when they run inland, they begin to want to redefine themselves as a people. And guess what they do? They take the story of the Canaanites, right? Remember the story in the Bible where the Israelites are captive by the Egyptians, and then God takes them through the Nile River and frees them from their oppressors, and they run inland and they go to Canaan, they redefine themselves, and they become the Israelites, who is God's people and God's chosen. So the same story happens, right? These individuals of Dutch descent run inland, and as they are moving inland, fighting different groups of people that they encountered along the way, begin to become the Afrikaner. And the Afrikaner becomes the new identity. It becomes their spirituality. It becomes their new way of understanding God, right? And this becomes the core of their story. But where the story becomes disruptive is not in the journey, right? The story becomes disruptive when power was then obtained by these individuals, and they then take the same Bible and literally take that and make that the new law, right? When you look at the apartheid laws, a lot of them were supported by theology. They were supported by understandings of God. They were supported by views that God had created the white man specifically to come down into Africa, this place full of heathens who had no understanding of God, to liberate them and to Christianize them, right? So that's the destruction. And the beauty about that journey is that we realize how disruptive the story of God can be when it is in relationship with people who are obsessed with power. And so when you think of power and when you think of the church, just keep in mind that these two are not always in relationship, because spirituality is much bigger and much broader than that. And that was the core of the Black Consciousness movement, was that God had no body, belonged to no people, had no physical features, and God was always in existence, but much further than what our human minds could actually comprehend.